My darling Erika, over 6 years have now passed, and we know that we will die very soon. Perhaps one day this journal will be found and you will know how we suffered. There are so few of us left. We are going slowly mad in all this darkness and hell. This is just a note to let you know that through all the years, the terrible years, my suffering never once exceeded my love for you. You are in my thoughts, always. Wherever I am going now, I will wait for you, I promise. Your loving Hans.
Hello, my name is Tony Matthews and I'm the author of Entombed, 6 Men Buried Alive for 6 Years, a novel inspired by actual events, which has now been published by Big Sky Publishing. And I'd like to give you a brief background to the book, how I came to write it, and what the book is actually about. This is without doubt the kind of story that writers and historians wait all their lives to discover, an untold story that boggles the imagination and seems completely unbelievable, but is true nonetheless. I have literally been waiting all my adult life to find and write this one story. I knew it would capture the imagination of the world, and it has. When Entombed was first published here in Australia, it was also quickly sold to a major European publisher. So, what is Entombed? How did I find and develop this story, and why is it one of the greatest untold epics of World War II? To answer those questions, we have to go back to the mid-1990s. At that time, I had been awarded a 2-year commission to research and write a comprehensive history of the city of Maryborough. As part of the research into that very complex history, it was necessary for me to read every newspaper that had been published in the region since the country's quite brutal colonial years. This included reading every edition of the city's most influential publication, the Maryborough Chronicle, which had commenced publishing in 1860 and later became a daily newspaper. As may be imagined, this in itself was a mammoth task. By the time I reached those editions published during the 1950s, more than 90 years after the paper had first appeared, I had read around 25,000 newspapers and was becoming rather punch-drunk. Then suddenly a small report buried on one of the back pages of the newspaper caught my eye. The blunt, unvarnished piece was just a few lines in length and deliberately appeared to have been placed where only a small number of people would read it. However, in a few sparse sentences, it gave the barest account of the discovery of some men, former German army soldiers, who had accidentally been buried alive in a vast military stores bunker at the port of Gdynia in Poland in 1945 and had remained buried deep underground for well over 6 years. At first, I could not believe what I was reading. I thought there must have been some mistake. Perhaps the British journalist who wrote the piece had made a typo and written years instead of weeks. I had been researching the era of the Second World War for a very long time, but had never heard of 6 men having been trapped underground for such a lengthy period. I copied the story on one of those old wet paper copiers, set the soggy page aside to dry, and wondered why the report had not appeared as front page headlines. I was intensely busy at the time with a publishing deadline to meet, so I filed the copy for future reference. Within a few days, however, I discovered another similar story, and this article provided a few further points of interest. By now, I knew that this was the kind of story that needed further examination because it had almost limitless potential. I began to delve deeper. What I discovered astonished me, and I realized very quickly that I would have to write both a book and screenplay based upon these events. However, none of that came about immediately. I was already deeply committed to the Maryborough history, and as soon as I had completed that twin-volume project, which was published under the title of River of Dreams, I was literally swamped by requests to write other histories, many of which took up to 2 years. So my plans to write a book about the trapped German soldiers had to be shelved for more than a decade. When I eventually got around to writing Entombed, however, it became a lasting and intriguing passion, taking me on a fascinating historical journey that, metaphorically and periodically, saw me time-travelling back to the 1940s and 1950s for the next 15 or 16 years. But what is the book all about? Entombed is the story of 6 German soldiers led by a Wehrmacht officer, whom I have named Captain Hans von Roth, who were ordered to empty a massive stores bunker at Gdynia on Poland's Baltic coast. This was during the closing weeks of 1944 and the first few months of 1945. Soviet forces were rapidly approaching from the east, and the German garrison at Gdynia was desperately attempting to evacuate the port. Tens of thousands of wounded German soldiers, along with thousands of civilians, doctors, nurses, hospital orderlies, and vast numbers of ancillary military personnel, were attempting to flee. Many of these were being crammed on board ships at Gdynia for passage through the Baltic Sea to the port of Kiel and subsequently through the Kiel Canal to Hamburg. Included among those ships was the huge German liner Wilhelm Gustloff, which would later be sunk by a Soviet submarine with an estimated loss of 9,000 lives, about half of whom were children. It would become the worst maritime disaster in world history. While all this was taking place, the 6 German soldiers were working frantically to empty the stores facility. This bunker, in addition to containing a vast quantity of food, also contained a significant amount of munitions. Because of this, the bunker had been rigged with explosives and was to be destroyed once the vital stores had been brought to the surface. However, for some reason now unknown, the explosives detonated accidentally and the entire bunker was buried beneath an enormous amount of rubble. The members of the German demolition team who had set the explosive charges believed that the 6 men who had been in the bunker at the time would all have been killed, and as the Soviets were rapidly approaching the port, there was little or no time to investigate further. Soon afterwards, the port was abandoned by the Germans, the Soviets moved into the city, and no further thought was given to the 6 men who had been in the bunker at the time of the detonation. Yet, in fact, all 6 had survived the explosion, dazed, bruised and injured, but still very much alive. What followed were more than 6 terrible years as the men struggled desperately to survive what was certainly a grotesque form of living hell. They had plenty of food, principally military rations and field supplies, but not a single drop of water. Yet, how could they survive without water? Fortunately, the store also contained thousands of bottles of Rhine wine and schnapps. Of course, one cannot live forever on alcohol, but the soldiers were able to survive on this until it rained at the port heavily enough for water to drip through the rubble above them. They caught the muddied water in mugs and mess tins, filtered it through flour sacks, and mixed it with the wine to make it last longer. For the entire 6 years they were underground, this rainwater and wine mixture provided their bodies with just sufficient moisture for them to survive. The psychological stresses of being trapped underground were also formidable. As those first weeks and months progressed, it soon became evident to the men that they had little or no hope of rescue. They did not know what was happening in the port above them, of course. But before being trapped, they had known that the Germans had been evacuating and that the entire city would soon be in the hands of the enemy. Far underground, they would have heard the approaching sounds of heavy Soviet artillery and rocket batteries, and eventually all had gone quiet, as the port had been captured by Stalin's jubilant forces. At that moment, all 6 Germans realized that they were desperately alone in the darkness and would almost certainly die there. There was even the distinct possibility that if, by some miracle, the Soviets managed to rescue them, they would either be shot out of hand or sent to one of the notorious gulags in Siberia, where death was also highly likely. Fortunately, the trapped men had a large store of candles. They were not left in complete darkness, and with the bountiful supply of military rations, they realized that their deaths could be delayed at least for some considerable period. However, they had no knowledge of how long they could last under such appalling conditions. Eventually, 2 of the men cracked under the psychological pressures and committed suicide. Yet, this too left the remaining 4 soldiers with a diabolical problem. What could they do with 2 rotting corpses in a rat-infested bunker? There was nowhere to bury the dead, and the bodies would almost certainly heighten the probability of spreading disease to the surviving men. They eventually formulated a plan to bury the bodies in flour. Emptying 2 of the food barrels, the corpses were placed inside and covered with flour, which had the effect of embalming them. In later years, when the bunker would be excavated, the corpses would be found in remarkably good condition. In 1951, after almost 6.5 years underground, those who survived the terrible years of incarceration were discovered by Polish workers clearing the site for development. When the bunker was uncovered, the survivors climbed into the sunlight, confused and frightened. By now, they were totally blind. Their last candle had flickered out 2 years previously, and they had lived for that entire period in an impenetrable darkness that had induced complete blindness. I have fictionalized this story, of course, and my interpretation of events is told within the spectrum of a novel, but this is not just a story of 6 men trapped underground for over 6 years. It's also a poignant love story involving my constructed character, Erika von Roth, wife of one of the trapped men who, with the assistance of a British Army officer named Ben Marlow, spends those years desperately attempting to discover what became of her husband during the war. This is the story of immense struggle against immeasurable odds, a struggle tempered in fear, horror and death, but it is also a story of great love and anguish, the anguish of Erika von Roth, who, unaware that her husband is still trapped underground in Poland, is fighting to survive in post-war Germany. Erika must find her own way through the love of her lost husband and the growing unexpected and self-betraying love for Ben Marlow, a man who was once one of her sworn enemies. I have been asked why this astonishing story has not been told before, and the answer is fairly simple. When the survivors, I'm not saying how many, were eventually discovered, the story of their ordeal coincided with the major front-page news of the defection of Soviet spies Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean. For weeks thereafter, the story of the spy's defection dominated every form of media, and the discovery of a few former German soldiers after years trapped underground was relegated to the back pages of the newspapers. Even in Berlin, I discovered, it was reported as insignificant news. These were the days long before internet news services or social media, and the story of the soldiers was quickly, almost thankfully, forgotten. These events occurred shortly after the end of the war. All through the mid to late 1940s, many major and minor war crimes trials were taking place, and full details of the Holocaust, the brutal murder of more than 6 million Jewish people, were becoming increasingly well known. Germans were internationally regarded as pariahs and monsters, and that was especially the case for war criminals or anyone who had served as part of the German military. Therefore, when the fate of these 6 men was revealed to the world, it was a story that no one really wanted to hear. No one was interested in what had become of 6 men who had served in the Nazi military and had helped to maintain the power and authority of the most criminal, destructive, and murderous regime in the history of humankind. It was simply easier to put the story onto the back pages of the press, or not publish at all, and to move on as quickly and as painlessly as possible. My book, Entombed, has been written as a novel, but it has been based as closely as possible on all the known events and recounts this amazing story in all the details that have come down to us from that time. Thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoy my book.